Well, we've had a few out the last couple of weeks due to the fair, but we're jumping right back in where we left off. We got through the whole book of Judges last week. We didn't really go through the whole book, but we got through the whole book. We looked at Gideon and Samson primarily, but just to recap this, that whole book really, the Judges cycle pretty much takes care of the whole book as far as what's going on in a summarized way. Prosperity, then apostasy, then the nation would be oppressed, then they would finally turn to God in repentance, and then God would send a deliverer to them who was called a judge. And that judge was a military leader, kind of like Joshua, who would come in and save them, basically. Rescue them all throughout the land, each ruling in a small, not really ruling, but operating in a small area of the land, some of them simultaneously. And again, the two that we focused on were Gideon and Samson. And both of them had some tragedy in their lives, especially Samson. But that period was 350 years, and the book of Ruth, as we pointed out, fits in between chapters 12 and 13 of the book of Judges. And that was basically to tell us about one of the ancestresses of Jesus. Other stuff in there as well, but that's the main purpose of that book. Now, the kingdom of Israel consisted of 3 periods, according to one writer, the way he broke it down. There was the period that was under the guidance of the prophets, or under the guidance of prophets. That would be Moses through Samuel. Then there was the period that was under the rule of kings, which was from Saul, should say Saul, but Samuel is kind of an in-between there. Samuel to Babylonian captivity, but especially Saul being the first king. And then there was that under the reign of high priests, which was from Ezra to really the birth of Jesus, or I guess you could almost say until AD 70 when the nation of Israel was no more. But the period that's described in the books of Samuel, which are really just one book in the Hebrew Old Testament, closes one of these periods and begins another one. And the connecting link between these two was Samuel. So the first period closes and the second period begins, and Samuel was going to be the connecting link between these two periods of the history of Israel. Samuel was also significant for some other reasons. He was the author of the educational system of Israel. He was the prophet who presided over the selection of the first 2 kings of Israel. And he was the divinely appointed prophet who established the principle that the law of God is superior to the personal wishes of any earthly king. So Samuel was a pretty important man in Old Testament history. And 1st and 2nd Samuel really talk about the history of the kingdom of Israel from the termination of the Judges era to the close of the reign of David, which covers about 125 years. So the book of Judges covers 350 years, and now Samuel is going to cover another 125 years. And what we're dealing with in much of this is the renewal of the kingdom, because it was so tarnished, it was so disorganized, the Judges period just wreaked havoc upon Israel. And it wasn't any fault of God or the system that God put in place, but it was the people's fault. They did not live up to the task. It could have been a beautiful period, but it wasn't, because the people were not what they should have been, which was pretty much set up at the beginning of the book when it talks about how another generation rose up that didn't even know who Jehovah was. And it just went downhill from there. It's been described as triumph and tragedy, the books of Samuel. Got some of Israel's greatest moments of glory and then some of their darkest hours of defeat. And at the time when this book opens, Israel is under the oppression of the Philistines. They're in that judges cycle still at this point. And as one writer said, if Israel was to be delivered from the bondage of the heathen, it was necessary that it should first of all be redeemed from the bondage of sin and idolatry, that its false confidence in the visible pledges of the gracious presence of God should be shaken by heavy judgments, and the way prepared for its conversion to the Lord by deep humiliation. And so in order for that to happen, two things were necessary. Number one, the future prophet and spiritual leader must be born. And number two, the wicked priesthood must be cast away. And that's what's going to happen in the beginning of the 1 Samuel. The prophet who was going to lead this movement of renewal and redemption would be born. And then we're going to see that the priesthood that was corrupt is going to be done away with. Not the whole priesthood, but those who were at that time over the priesthood. So, 1 Samuel 1, really chapter 1, verse 2, through chapter 2, verse 11. We arrive at a place called Ramathaim Zophim in Ephraim and meet a certain man named Elkanah, who had two wives, and one of them he loved very much. Her name was Hannah, but she was barren. She had no children, and that was a great reproach to women. And the other woman was able to have children, and she liked to rub it in her face, apparently. But he loved Hannah the most anyway, and he gave her double portions. And notice in verses 5 and 6, it repeats the fact that Jehovah had closed her womb. Jehovah closed up her womb. So she was barren. This was not some medical assessment that they assumed she was barren because she hadn't had children yet. But the Bible tells us God made her unable to have children up to this point. He closed her womb. But she was very sad, deeply distressed. She would go to the temple, and verse 10 says she prayed to Jehovah and wept bitterly. She vows a vow, says, if you'll give me a son, I'll give him to you all the days of his life. No razor shall touch his head. Well, we should remember from last week, what does that make this son that hasn't been conceived yet? What is she vowing? He's going to be a Nazirite. Remember that same thing with Samson? He would be a Nazirite from the womb. Hannah is saying, if you'll give me a son, I'll make him a Nazirite from the womb. For all of his days, like Samson was supposed to be. No. Very rare. Samuel and Samson. And I can't remember if John the Baptizer, I don't think don't quote me on that, but I feel like there's at least one other one in the Bible. I just can't remember exactly. But it's rare. The Nazirite vow could be for any period. It could be a week, month, year, 2 years, 10 years. And then we come across these special circumstances and situations where somebody will be a Nazirite from birth. No razor to come upon his head. No grapes, nothing from the vine, etc. Mm-hmm.
That's different from being a Christian. These vows were made by their mothers.
Yeah.
Not by the ones who was. So I didn't know you could have a Nazirite vow without you being involved in it.
Yeah. Well, it would take discipline on the part of the person and respect for the mother the vow. In Samson's case, God appeared to them and said, your son will be a Nazirite from the womb, and you're not, even his mother wasn't allowed to eat anything off the vine because of the baby in her womb. So, the whatever the mother takes in will also be shared with the baby, so even she couldn't, and I'm assuming that would be the case with Hannah as well. In this case, Hannah is vowing it beforehand that if he would bless her with a son, then that son would be his. Not just in a spiritual sense, strictly spiritual sense, and not just in the obvious sense, but she's going to literally give this child to God by taking him to the temple where he would be raised there, pretty much. Not in his earliest years, but almost like a foster son, taken to the temple to live there permanently and be raised up. The Apostle Paul was maybe in a lesser sense, he did that. He said that he came to Jerusalem at a very early age and was raised as a Pharisee, and the indication seems to be that he didn't come with his family. He went there, was sent there to be raised in that setting.
Like a boarding school, or somewhere people send their kids off?
Yeah, pretty much. Well, Hannah's at the temple. She's praying. She's vowing this prayer. It says that as she continued to pray, Eli, the high priest, observed her mouth. It says she was speaking in her heart. She was moving her lips, but she wasn't speaking out loud. And Eli thought she was drunk. I don't know if drunk women normally came to the temple and were mouthing nonsense. I don't know if that was a normal thing, but he seemed to not be surprised. He thought that was what was going on. But he rebukes her for being drunk before he even, it must have not been that uncommon, because he said, woman, how long are you going to put that bottle away? How long until you're going to put that bottle down? But when she answered, she really gave one of the best definitions of prayer that you'll find anywhere. She said, I'm not drunk. I haven't drunk anything. I've been pouring out my soul before Jehovah. That's what prayer is supposed to be right there. Pouring out your soul to Jehovah. That is the definition of prayer. Pour out your soul. I've been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. Well, when she left, it says that she ate, which she hadn't been doing, and that her face was no longer sad. She already felt better for whatever reason. But then we read, Elkanah knew Hannah, his wife, and Jehovah remembered her, and in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son. She called his name Samuel, for she said, I've asked for him from Jehovah. Pointed out in the past, I'll point out again very quickly, no miracle at all performed here. Samuel was conceived in the exact same way that every child has ever been conceived. At least until very recent years when new methods have been invented. But long time away from there, from that point in time, was Hannah and Elkanah. So Elkanah and Hannah came together, but Jehovah remembered her in that. And just as he had previously closed her womb, now he opened it. And she conceived and bore a son in the natural way. Yet God directly acted in it, but the way that Samuel was conceived was not a miracle. It was purely natural. Yeah, Joe?
Earlier when Eli said, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him, was he asking God on her behalf, or was he telling her God's going to grant this?
I think he was just being courteous. I think he didn't know what she asked. She just said, I've been pouring out my soul and I've been speaking out of my great anxiety. So it was more like a part apology, maybe for his false assumption. But he's just saying, I hope it works out, kind of, you know.
Priests of today in Catholicism, whatever, once a priest pronounces something and people hear it, they believe it.
Yeah.
And it says here, she went away her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad, because I think she thought he was acting on her behalf before God. You see
Maybe.
what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
I thought maybe she felt better
She may have felt better after praying.
having poured her soul out.
Yeah. It could go either way. I'm sure she felt better after her exchange with Eli anyway, especially if he thought she was drunk and, you know, she convinced him that she wasn't, and he spoke kindly to her. And whatever his intentions were in saying that, I don't know if that had a part in her feeling better or what. If it was just praying, pouring out her soul. She obviously had an optimistic feeling about it. And for good reason. I mean, apparently, whether it was coincidence, I don't know. But in due time, notice it mentions that they came together as husband and wife. And then in due time. So it's not even like it seems, the text doesn't even seem to indicate it happened on the first try. But just, I mean, as natural and normal as it can possibly be, and yet God was directly acting here. So again, we see that providence isn't where God does something indirectly necessarily, but God can act directly even in providence. He doesn't need miracles to do amazing things. Here's what we read to open up chapter, not quite to open, after Hannah's prayer of thanksgiving. An ominous statement. Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know Jehovah. Now who was Eli again? He was the high priest. Well, you don't want his sons to be worthless men. That's not good. If anybody's sons shouldn't be worthless men at this point, it would be a man in Eli's position. But this is the way that it was. His sons were worthless. They didn't know Jehovah. They were corrupt. They treated the offering of Jehovah with contempt. Somewhere it mentions that they took bribes and such. Verse 30 says they despised Jehovah himself. By the way, verse 21 says that God wasn't finished blessing Hannah, but she had 3 more sons and 2 daughters. And the boy Samuel grew in the presence of Jehovah. Kind of like the language about Jesus when he was a youth, and we're told that he grew in favor with God and men, and he continued to grow in strength and wisdom and such. Here Samuel is in that same position. And though it seems that Eli had somewhat failed as a father, he hadn't failed completely. He at least tried to smack some sense into his worthless sons. In verses 22 and following, it says he was very old. He kept hearing about all his sons were doing in Israel. Lay with women who were serving at the entrance of the tent. Worthless is a pretty kind word, it sounds like, for what they actually were. He said to his sons, "Why you do such things? What's wrong with you? Nitwits." Worse than nitwits. Good word, nitwit. He says, "It's no good report that I hear the people of Jehovah spreading abroad. If someone sins against a man, God will mediate for him. But if someone sins against Jehovah, who can intercede for him? But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of Jehovah to put them to death. And that's a disturbing statement, isn't it? They wouldn't listen to the voice of their father. Well, I got a feeling Eli's sons had a habit, a long-standing habit of not listening to the voice of their father. Seems pretty clear. Well, they had gotten to the point where God had said enough. And so now God knows that this priesthood in the hands of this household cannot be salvaged. There's no saving it unless these men are gone. There's no hope for Israel. So God has to step in. Patience won't do it in this case. This is one of those instances, sort of like in Genesis 6. God's got to step in and save the day directly and drastically. And in this case, it was about getting rid of this house. They cannot be the priesthood anymore. And again in verse 26, like verse 21, the boy Samuel continued to grow both in stature and in favor with Jehovah and also with man. So almost exactly like it said about Jesus. He continued to grow. Okay. I feel like there is somebody else. It could just be Samuel and Samson, but I'll have to look into that and see. But it was clearly rare. Okay. He may have been just not from the womb or whatever, like as strongly as Samuel and Samson were.
I mean, we're told what his diet was, and it definitely would be consistent with
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, you would think. It's not a diet I would want to have, but. Well, suddenly a man of God came to Eli, nameless man of God. And the scripture's nameless, that is. And he's going to tell him that God has rejected your house. You will no longer be the priest. Priesthood will no longer be in your house. Verse 30, he says, I promised that your house and the house of your father should go in and out before me forever. But now, he says, things have changed. Now, Jehovah declares, far be it from me. For those who honor me, I will honor. Those who despise me shall be lightly esteemed. The implication being that Eli and his household had despised Jehovah. So now they will not be honored by God. Former promises have been canceled because of their faithlessness, and worse than faithlessness. It says, the days are coming when I'll cut off your strength and the strength of your father's house, so there'll not be an old man in your house. In distress you'll look with envious eye on all the prosperity that shall be bestowed on Israel. There shall not be an old man in your house forever, so on and so forth. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. I will build him a sure house. He shall go in and out before my anointed forever. Everyone who's left in your house shall come to implore him for a piece of silver and a loaf of bread, shall say, please put me in one of the priest's places that I may eat a morsel of bread. So God has rejected Eli's household and the priesthood there. But that was yet to come. Well, we're not ready for that yet. Thought I had one more slide there. Chapter 3, God's going to call Samuel then. And he's a child, or a boy, some versions say, and he's ministering to Jehovah in the presence of Eli. So he had been sent to the temple, or the tabernacle, rather, I should say, serving with Eli, under Eli's care. It says the word of Jehovah was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. That's interesting. It's kind of like today, isn't it? Only today, I wouldn't say the word of Jehovah is rare, because, in one way it's more common than ever, but in another way, it's more rare than ever. But certainly there's no frequent vision because there's no vision. Mm-hmm.
I get lost in the timeline from time. Was Eli supposed to have killed or stoned disobedient children?
Well,
Was everyone else expected to do that?
it seems that his sons were his sons were even beyond just disobedient. They were just flat out rebels.
So God just did what Eli didn't.
Yeah, he clearly blames Eli for a lot of this. And, maybe it's just human sympathy, but I kind of feel sorry for Eli a little bit. He seems to be humble in a lot of ways because he accepts what he's told, meekly, but he failed somewhere, somehow. He did not, all of his sons being like this, however many he had, the sons that are in question here, there was a failure somewhere, and God says he failed him. So he puts a lot of the blame on him. Something should have been done about his sons here, for sure. And nothing had been done, so God's going to do it. So at that time, this time when the word of Jehovah was rare and there was no frequent vision, Eli, the high priest, is old. His eyesight had grown dim. He's lying down in his own place. It said the lamp of God had not yet gone out. Samuel was lying down in the temple of Jehovah, where the ark of God was. And Jehovah called Samuel, and Samuel said, "Here I am." And this is something that happens 3 different times. He thinks it's Eli calling to him. It's not that crazy. Why would he think it's God? For one thing, he's young. For another thing, the word of Jehovah was rare in the first place. So even if he wasn't young, he wouldn't have expected it automatically to be God. He thinks it's Eli, his master, more or less. He goes in there and says, "Here I am. What do you need?" Eli said, "I didn't call you. Go back to sleep." Jehovah called again, "Samuel." Samuel rose and said, "Here I am. What do you want? You called for me." Said, "I didn't call. Go back to bed." It says, now Samuel didn't yet know Jehovah. The word of Jehovah had not yet been revealed to him. He doesn't know what God's voice sounds like. Never heard it before. But anyway, happens again. Eli says, "Okay, go back to bed. If he calls you again, say, 'Speak, Jehovah, for your servant hears.'" Jehovah came and stood, calling as at other times, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant hears." And now he says, "I'm about to do something in Israel in which the 2 ears of everyone who hears it will tingle." And he's talking about how he's going to fulfill against Eli what he said about the rejection. "I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever." Well, this is a pretty big test for Samuel. This is his first word from Jehovah, and he's got to tell Eli, "I'm about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God and he didn't restrain them. Therefore, I swear to the house of Eli that his iniquity will not be atoned for by sacrifice." He will not get out of this, is what he's saying. Nothing he can do. He's gone too far. It's done. So Samuel lay there till the morning. He's afraid to tell Eli about the vision. And no wonder. But Eli called him. He said, "What did he tell you? Don't hide it from me. He said, "May God do so to you and more if you hide a single thing from me that he told you." So Samuel told him every single bit. And Eli's reaction was, "It is Jehovah. Let him do what seems good to him." You see, that's a very humble response. A lot of people would just even be devastated and break down with tears and mourning or anger even. But not Eli. He said, it's Jehovah. Let him do whatever seems good to him. And again, Samuel grew. Jehovah was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. All Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet. So here this prophet's rising up to be this mediator in this unique period of Israelite history. Jehovah appeared again at Shiloh, for Jehovah revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of Jehovah. So now Samuel is starting to become known as the prophet. He is the prophet of Israel. Just like Moses was the prophet. And then Joshua after him was not really a prophet, but he was the man. He was the, whatever you want to call him, the spokesman of God to an extent. The middleman. So the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Well, now they're going to go out to battle against the Philistines. They go out. The Philistines are encamped at Aphek. The Israelites are encamped at Ebenezer. They're going to go to battle. And it is not the result they would want. They get smashed. They go back. After they blame God, they come up with a plan B, okay? And to paraphrase their plan B, it was like this. Well, if Jehovah won't come to the battlefield, we'll just drag him to the battlefield. So they go back to Shiloh, 18 miles east. And then they get the Ark of Jehovah, and they take it to the battle. Well, 30,000 were killed in action, including Eli's 2 sons, presumably the sons that were mentioned before. But worst of all, the Ark of the Covenant was taken. This had never happened before. The Ark of the Covenant was taken from them. And this was the absolute worst thing that could have happened. The Philistines now have the Ark of Jehovah. The thing that gave them their power, from all, human perspective. This is the thing that usually led them to win in battles. So in theory, if you got this thing, you're going to win every battle, no matter what. That's the way it would. This was in a sense Jehovah himself. This was the most precious thing. They took it to the battle. They lost again, and the ark was taken by the Philistines. Well, a lone Benjaminite makes it back to Shiloh, and he told Eli, who was now 98 years old, by the way. And notice, he says in chapter 4, verse 16, I am he who has come from the battle. I fled from the battle today. Eli said, how did it go? He said, Israel has fled before the Philistines. Bad news number 1. There's also been a great defeat among the people. Bad news number 2. Then he says, your sons also are dead. Bad news number 3. And the ark of God has been captured. Now notice what verse 18 says. As soon as he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell over backward from his seat by the side of the gate and broke his neck. Now, the thing I find most interesting about that is that you would assume it would have been the mention of his sons that would have caused that. He just said, your 2 sons are dead. But what he felt, what moved him even more than that, was the fact that the ark was taken. That tells you how serious that is. Even more than his 2 sons being dead. It was the mention of the capture of the ark of God that did this to Eli. So Eli is now dead. Then we read about his daughter-in-law who was pregnant. She's about to give birth. And when she heard the news that the ark of God was captured, she went into labor, and she was not going to make it through the birth. She was out of it. They said, it's okay, don't worry, you've born a son. But it says that she didn't pay attention, she didn't answer, she was not even there. She was outside of herself to an extent. She named the child Ichabod, saying, the glory has departed from Israel because the ark of God had been captured and because of her father-in-law and her husband. So even in this situation, the ark of God being taken was absolutely devastating. The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured, is what she said, I guess were her last words. The ark of God has been captured. This is a very horrifying time for Israel. And it's all because of their, I don't know what you'd call it, stupidity maybe. Although maybe logically it made sense. Well, we need to take the ark with us because, that's what we did before. But no, something more was not going right, and they weren't, I guess, paying attention to the signs. Well, very quickly, it's almost humorous. After that, very extremely dark chapter. Chapter 5 kind of lightens the mood a little bit, in my opinion, when we get to peer in, be a fly on the wall in the Philistines' territory while they got the ark of God. So how's it going to go for them? Well, they bring it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. So they take the ark to Ashdod, and they put it in the house of Dagon, their god. So they got the ark of Jehovah in the temple of Dagon. And when the people of Ashdod got up the next day, they see that Dagon had fallen on his face toward, before the ark of Jehovah. So it's like bowing down to the ark of Jehovah. It's like, well, this is strange. Our God's fallen down. He doesn't normally fall down. He's got pretty good balance, but for some reason he's fallen down. We need to help our God get up, Well, they did that. Next day, it says, let me see. They rose early the next morning, verse 4. This time he fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of Jehovah, and his head and his hands were off. Now he don't have a head or hands. Only the base of the image was left. So they decided, we need to do something here. Because in addition to that, God terrified and afflicted them with tumors. All the people in Ashdod and that territory. So they said, we got to get this thing out of here. This was a bad idea. So they sent the ark, probably to the people they liked the least, I guess. Let's send it over there to Gath. Nobody likes Gath anyway. We'll send the ark to Gath and say, hey, will you watch this for us? Well, guess what happened? When they took it to Gath, now all the people in Gath are getting tumors and whatnot. So then they took it to Ekron. It's like playing hot potato here. Move this thing. Get it out of here. Look at what's happening to everybody this thing goes to. Then the people of Ekron probably heard about it by then. They're like, well, thanks a lot. We don't want this thing. They brought it around to us, the ark of the God of Israel, to kill us and our people. That's what they said, verse 10. Well, they called and said, get this thing away from us. Take it. Take it back. Panic through the whole city. The hand of God was very heavy there. The men who did not die were struck with tumors, and the cry of the city went up. Well, finally, after 7 months of this hot potato game, they called the diviners. Said, what do we need to do? And they said, okay, send the ark of God back, but don't send it back empty. Fill that thing with all kinds of gifts. Send some gifts. Do whatever you got to do. Guilt offering, 5 golden tumors, and 5 golden mice. Make images. Make images of your tumors. That was probably fun. Make images of your mice that ravage the land and give glory to the God of Israel. They're doing everything they can possibly think of to get rid of this issue, this problem, this plague. Perhaps he'll lighten his hand from off you and your gods and your land. Why should you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh hardened their hearts? That's not a bad question. Don't do what Pharaoh did. See, they're learning from history. See what happened to Pharaoh and Egypt when they messed with Jehovah? Well, we're not going to be those people. We're going to do it right. We're going to handle this properly. So they prepared a new cart and 2 milk cows. Never been yoked before. And they took their calves away from them. And they said, put that ark on this cart. By the way, this is the first mention we have of the ark ever being on a cart. And that's going to play a role later on whenever the Israelites decided, hey, that's a pretty good idea. We'll do that too. And then tragedy happened as a result of that because that's not the way it was supposed to be transported. Well, they put the box in there with all these gifts for God. And they sent it off and they said, if it goes, a certain way, they said to follow it. If it goes up to Beth Shemesh, then we know that it is he who has done us this great harm. But if not, then we'll know that it was coincidence. They did it. They put the cows on there, took the calves home, put the ark on the cart, all the gifts in there. Cows went, boom, beeline to Beth Shemesh. Okay?
So did they actually put all the items they made in the ark?
I guess as much as they could. It seems to suggest they put them in there. Maybe there were more that they had to put with it somehow. But I guess they put some in there. They probably loaded. It sounds like this was a pretty big effort. They may have loaded that thing down with all kinds of these things. But based on their little plan or whatever, if this happens, then we'll know this. Kind of like Jonathan and his armor bearer. We'll reveal ourselves, and if they say, come up, then we know that Jehovah's with us. But if they say, wait a minute, hold it right there, then we'll know that, we got to come up with another plan. And it worked out. Well, they said, if he goes to Beth Shemesh, don't guide it at all. You just kind of follow it and watch at a distance. Beeline to Beth Shemesh. They knew that it was Jehovah that had done this. People of Beth Shemesh were reaping their wheat harvest in the valley, and when they lifted up their eyes and saw the ark, they rejoiced. This is great. This is a great day. The ark of Jehovah, here, these cows just brought it back. What are the odds? Well, came into the field of Joshua of Beth Shemesh and stopped there. And very wisely, it says the Levites came and took it down. And the men of Beth Shemesh offered burnt offerings and sacrificed that day to Jehovah. And the great stone beside which they set down the ark of Jehovah is a witness to this day in the field of Joshua of Beth Shemesh. But then it says, and he struck some of the men of Beth Shemesh because they looked upon the ark of Jehovah. Wait a minute, you can't even look at it? I thought they weren't supposed to touch it. Well, look at Numbers 4:20. They shall not go in to look on the holy things even for a moment, lest they die. They should have paid attention to that. That's Numbers chapter 4. That's a long time ago. They already knew that. Well, they violated that. And 70 men were struck. And the people mourned them. And they were scared. They sent messengers to Kiriath Jearim to let them know. And that's where the ark was going to go. And it stayed there for 20 years. So the Philistines had it for 7 months. Now they've got it back, and it's going to stay at Kiriath Jearim for 20 whole years. And all the house of Israel lamented after Jehovah, it says. So this is, one of these judges cycles where they even though we're past the book of Judges, but they're still in that last phase, what would prove to be the last phase, at least in the Judges cycle technically. And here we're left seeing them lamenting. They are longing after Jehovah. And Samuel speaks to them and gives them teaching and instruction. He tells them, you need to put away these foreign gods. They did put away the foreign gods. They served Jehovah only. That's verse 4 of chapter 7. And then he said to gather at Mizpah. So they all gathered at Mizpah. And they confessed their sin. And the people said, don't stop crying out to Jehovah for us. Please, man of God. So we got teaching and instruction. We got repentance and obedience. We got confession of sin. We got prayer. We got offering. We've got forgiveness in verse 9. All right there. Samuel cried out to Jehovah for Israel, and Jehovah answered him. And they set up a memorial there at Mizpah and called its name Ebenezer. For he said, till now Jehovah has helped us. Ebenezer means stone of help. And this is where the song we sing, what is it? O thou fount of every blessing. Is that what it is? Here I raise my Ebenezer. And if you've ever sang that and thought, am I speaking in tongues here? What in the world am I saying? I've never raised an Ebenezer my whole life. Well, it's a reference to 1 Samuel 7:12 when they raised up this memorial and called it Ebenezer because Ebenezer means stone of help. And so the idea, figuratively and spiritually, is a reference to God's help, a memorial for God's help. So when we raise our Ebenezer, we are remembering God's gracious help of us in different times in our lives.
Well, that's what the song finishes out with. Hither by thy help I come.
Yeah, so there's the reference to the help, yeah. But if you don't know what Ebenezer is, then it still seems out of place and kind of random. So Samuel then has this annual cycle in this little small territory. Ramah, then he'd go to Gilgal, then he'd go, to Bethel, then Gilgal, and Mizpah. These 4 places, Ramah, Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, and then back to Ramah. That's what he did every year. He made this annual cycle. And this is sort of a calm, they've repented and everything, but this is pretty much a calm before the storm because Israel's about to make the greatest mistake of their lives in chapter 8. This big grand period of forgiveness and repentance in chapter 7 is going to be bombarded by their more tragic stupidity when they are going to make a mistake that would change the course of their nation and their relationship with God forever. And that's what we'll begin looking at, Lord willing, next week with chapter 8, a very monumental chapter when Israel says, hey, we want to be like the other nations. Give us a king. So just when everything's looking as good as it has for hundreds of years, the priesthood's been purged. Samuel has brought back the people to Jehovah. He's led them to return to Jehovah with all their heart. They've gotten rid of their idols. Now they're going to say, hey, we want to be like those other nations and have a king. And it's just, the bubble is burst and Samuel's world just comes crashing down right on top of it.